Okay, so we've talked about the two different price level measures that we use, the GDP deflator and CPI. They're a little bit different, and the main difference is the basket of goods that's used to weight different prices to find the overall price level. GDP deflator looks at all goods and services that are produced domestically, while CPI looks at a sample consumption basket sample from urban households. Okay. Couple issues with that are, well, consumption bundles are going to change over time. Okay. Meaning some goods aren't going to be used as much, like house phones being used a lot less. Why? Because everyone's using a cell phone. Well, cell phones we didn't have in 1980. Well, for the most part, we didn't have in 1980. How are we going to compare, price level of goods in 1980 that doesn't include cell phones to the price level in 2020 where we have cell phones all over the place? A little bit of a flaw with CPI. Same thing with just other goods being improved upon. In today's dollars, you may be spending the same amount on something, but the quality of that good may have drastically increased. So you're relatively paying a lower price. So that's not going to be captured by CPI. Okay, a little bit of a flaw. The deflator, some things are included in the GDP deflator that aren't going to be purchased. Some goods are going to be included that aren't going to be purchased by households. Things like big purchases that are made by the government, things like tanks. Most households aren't buying tanks. Well, they're being produced domestically, and therefore they're going to be included in the price level when using the GDP deflator, but not going to be included when finding the price level using CPI. So there's some differences between the two different price level measures. But do these measures drastically vary over time? Well, the answer is not really. There's a little more volatility in the consumer price index, the blue line. So if we look at this chart here, we have inflation on the left-hand side. So that's the percent change from the previous year for the different price levels, which is the same as, hopefully you're picking up on, as inflation. And we see that the consumer price index is in blue here. We see that the consumer price index, particularly during the volatile times, really starts to jump around more than the GDP deflator. So we see, when inflation starts to rise, we see the blue line being a little bit higher than the red line. When it starts to drop, you see the blue line drop a little bit more than the red line. So you're seeing a little bit more volatility in the consumer price index, which makes sense. It makes sense because you're finding CPI via a sample compared to the consumer price, the GDP deflator, where you're finding that via the entire population of goods being produced. So you have a larger sample essentially, which means there's less volatility in estimating the inflation rate and the price level. So it's not surprising that we see a little bit more volatility in the consumer price index. Okay, but for the most part, they move relatively similar. You see during these gray periods, these gray blocks represent recessions. So you see that, during the 70s and the 80s, the oil shocks that occurred really drove prices up, and that's a source of inflation. Is when the supply of inputs, the cost of inputs, really starts to increase. Usually through, at least in the oil shocks, it was through a restriction in the supply of inputs, specifically oil. But input prices rising drive up output prices to rise, and leading to inflation. So you're seeing, in the 70s and 80s, you're seeing price levels rise, mainly through inputs, the cost of inputs rising through a lack of supply of inputs. And then, later on you see, the dot-com bubble recession and bubble bursting, the dot-com recession, and then the Great Recession we see later. We see, prices drastically drop about midway through the recession, and don't start to recover. I mean, here we actually had some deflation after the Great Recession, and you don't see prices here yet. Prices started to deflate at a lower rate after the recovery, but still inflation really low even after the recession, after the Great Recession ended. So sometimes it does take prices a little bit of time after the recession to fully recover. But both indicators moving in generally the same direction as one another. And so we see that both with inflation, and we see it with the overall price level. Now here, before the base period of 2012, where both the GDP deflator and CPI are equal to 100, we see that the GDP deflator has a little bit higher of an index, but that maintains for the most part even after the base period. So again, GDP deflator and CPI moving relatively in similar fashions. So they both do, a pretty good job of measuring the price level, and both, have similar results. So what causes inflation? Well, again, I kind of touched on it a little bit. Increases in the cost of inputs are going to drive up prices of output overall, driving up overall prices. But then also, and we'll talk about this later, growth in the money supply. As more currency is made available and printed, and introduced into the economy, people have more spending power. They have more currency to be able to spend, which means that currency isn't going to be able to buy as much stuff as prices rise. We'll talk about that more when we talk about money and banking. I guess just to note, what we'll highlight is the relationship between the growth in the money supply and growth in output. And the more that the growth in the money supply outpaces the growth in output, the more inflation we'll have. Okay. Again, we'll discuss that a little bit later on in the semester. But the real costs, or the scariest of cost of inflation, are when price levels rise uncontrollably. When you have something called hyperinflation. There's a bunch of different definitions of hyperinflation. I think our book specifies hyperinflation as a doubling in the price level within 3 years. Some are less restrictive. Some definitions of hyperinflation are less restrictive than that. Some a little bit more. Generally speaking, hyperinflation is the biggest problem when the price level is changing so frequently and in such large amounts that the purchasing power of a currency is significantly deteriorated. And I've posted 2 videos that I'll let you take a look at, kind of explaining those types of situations. One was recently in Venezuela, where they had hyperinflation last year, all through a lot of last year. And then the other examples from Germany after World War One. There is a lot of inflation from Germans having these payments, these reparation payments that had to be made to the countries they were at war with in World War One, and to make those payments, they printed off a lot of money, such that that currency lost a lot of value. Okay. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk about the consequences and the benefits of inflation, or causes or further consequences of inflation and further benefits, but not specific to hyperinflation, more specific around the redistribution of wealth that's caused by unanticipated inflation. Okay, all right.